I'll make a start then. People will come in and join as and when, but we've got quite a lot to go through and only an hour. But firstly, my name's Ian Priddin. I'm an improvement manager at ESIS, the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team. Thank you so much for joining our second learning event in the supporting operational processes part work stream of our hospital-only discharge collaborative approach. We appreciate how busy things are for everyone, and it means a lot that everyone is taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. For anyone who isn't able to join, these sessions are available recorded. So let's crack on then. Move on to the next slide, please. So firstly, by way of an introduction, you'll all be aware that the systems you'll be involved in are part of the hospital-only discharge task force, which has been running for a good few months now. So 15 organisations being supported through the work stream. These learning events are one of a number of ways in which ESIS are trying to support systems throughout who are involved in the process. Next slide, please, Crystal. There's four key focuses of our work streams, one being frailty, one being workforce, one focused on board rounds and ward rounds, and the other one supporting operational processes, which for me as a non-clinical member of staff is a real valuable part of the story in terms of trying to chase discharge, which is often forgotten. You know, the clinical staff have got a big part to play in this, obviously, but there is also a role for the operational processes that are supported. So I, for one, am very proud that this is one of the work streams. Next slide, please, Crystal. So as I say, we've taken a varied approach to this. We're really trying to be collaborative and use as many different ways of kind of engaging and supporting sites as possible, and signposting people to various different bits of resources that we can get. This is the learning events. We're on our second one in this work stream. There'll be 4 for each work stream, very much led by the people that are here. So, you know, we've already got one a work stream plan for the next one, but if anyone else wants to make any suggestions about what would be helpful us to cover in the next learning event, that's fine. It really should be a two-way thing, and we're trying to make sure that we doing everything that people need. As in addition to the learning events, we've got QI coaching available, clinical coaching, expert resources, and access to our improvement network. Next slide, please. So the learning events, as I've said, we've got 4 per theme. We try and have ESIS clinicians and clinical staff from the sites on all of them so that they can be clinically led. Keynote spookers. Help me out, someone. Keynote speakers for each session. Trying to provide top tips, and we always leave time at the end for a facilitated question and answer for any questions that anyone would like to ask. And as I said, all of the sessions are available to share and view on demand for those that aren't able to make it. Next slide, please, Crystal. So this is just about kind of what we're here to do, really. You know, we're all aware of the best practice in terms of improving flow through our hospitals, including discharge, but these are the key kind of take homes from our mantra, really. So the first one being that discharge is everybody's business. We know that achieving the standards of flow are not just about targets, but about reducing harm to patients. Consistency and of board rounds is a key part of that, as is internal professional standards, and optimizing processes for discharge related activities. Next slide, please. Just a reminder of the work stream objectives for this work stream. So we were looking to optimize patient pathways and balance risk, implement sustainable changes using a quality improvement approach, and showcase good practice, including the focus model, internal professional standards, and criteria to lead discharge. So this is the work stream, and this is very much what some of the content of these sessions is based upon. Next slide, please. Just a quick update from the previous session, which was very well attended, and I think anyone that was there really enjoyed it. One of our improvement managers, Richard Brownell, did a focus on ergonomics and human factors. It just covered a few of the definitions and origins of human factors, how it can be used in our work, and it had a really practical worked example of some of the models and theories that could be applied using internal professional standards as a basis. So that, for those of you who weren't able to join that session, it is available, and I'm sure that Crystal will share the link for that after this session. So moving on to our next session, today we're delighted to have Nick Holden, who's one of our improvement managers, who will introduce himself shortly, on bridging the gap between knowing and doing. So we're looking very much at improvement in practice. So how knowing what you need to do is one thing, but doing it is often different. And I'm sure Nick's going to tell us a lot more about that when we move on. The next learning event is on the 19th of July, which we'll be doing a review of the focus model. The fourth learning event is still to be decided. We're very much taking feedback on what people are asking for and what people will find useful. And what would be really good for us, there's a bit of time between the July event and the September, is if anyone has put anything they've learned from this work stream into practice and would like to share that experience, that, you know, we'd be really grateful to have some input from one of the hospital only discharge sites to share with us their journey of that they've done. So any volunteers for that, please get in touch, and you could be our next keynote speaker. So thank you. Next slide, please. Without further ado, I'll hand over to my learned friend and colleague, Nick Holden. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for that introduction and a bit of a summary of where we're at in terms of programs. So I wanted to share with you some thoughts really around this. What we talk a lot about, the knowing and doing gap, and I'll talk a lot about how we should be thinking like a farmer, you know, think about how we prepare our soil before we move into improvement work. Sometimes we get a little bit busy and we want to launch in without really having any kind of preparation. That's really what I sort of focus on today. So as Ian said, my name's Nick Holding. I'm an improvement manager with the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Ballsboy. We've also got our ECS Network Twitter account there for anybody who wants it. We've got Erica on the chat room today. She's been keeping on the chat room. So if you want to post any questions as they go, please feel free, and we'll pick those up later on. Any comments, more than happy to pick those up. And if we don't get time today, I will definitely come back to you after the session as well. If there's any particular questions or queries that you have, or anything you want to raise with me, my email address is connected to this call, so please do drop me a line if you want to chat anymore. So we talked about this knowing and doing gap, and as Ian mentioned there, it's about how we move from, you know, what essentially we know often we know what we need to do, but how do we move that into action? As Pfeffer and Sutton talk about in their book, turning knowledge into action. And I think, you know, the reason why I've chosen this as a subject for this session is because I just see it so often across the NHS. In the last sort of 20 years, I've been involved in improvement practice. These barriers between we kind of know what we need to do, but just actually breaking through in interaction is often the most difficult bit. And recognizing, you know, we work in complex systems, very, very complex systems. We work, as Richard talked about last time, it's socio-technical. We talk about complex adaptive systems. Recognise it's not easy. If it was easy, we'd have done it by now. We understand some of the psychology of change that sits behind some of the barriers and some of the reasons why we don't make those shifts. But recognising that today, in a half an hour, we are only going to scratch the surface, and we could probably do a whole webinar series on psychology of change, and then maybe something for we might just do in the future. So there's a couple of areas I want to focus on in how we understand this bridge between knowing where we need to be but knowing where we want to get to. And there's a couple of things that stand out here in terms of some of the barriers, and we've picked up on one here. Is I'm going to start with incorrect assumptions, and this goes back again to something that Richard was talking about in the last session. Knowing what we need to do often gets in the way as we leap forward into the future, and we find it hard to break through into action. And some of those incorrect assumptions that we find ourselves, as Richard illustrated in the last session, is that We see the world through our own eyes, and we have a little bit of subjective opinion of that, and a little bit of self-serving attributional bias, backed up with a bit of self-confidence bias. We believe that we're right often before we start, but as I often ask, how do you know that you're right if you think you're right? So those incorrect assumptions, maybe that we believe everybody understands what's expected of them. Maybe we believe that we've communicated the message in a way which is understood by everybody. Sometimes we can have this a perception, how we see the world through our own eyes, where we develop those incorrect assumptions. Again, as we talked about last time, this research by Taleb around naive interventionism, the feeling that we have to do stuff, we have to get on, and we've been asked to do something, so we have to get on and do it, and we find ourselves on that hamster wheel of just finding ourselves in a doing trap all the time. We have to get on and do some stuff, and this relates back to some work and a book written by David Marquet, and he refers to this idea of red and blue work. Red work, where it's the doing work, and blue work is our thinking time work. It's all work, but we just separate it out into two different types of work. We find ourselves too often in this, we're on the hamster wheel, and we can't allow ourselves to get off because we need to do the doing. It needs to be done. But there's a balance in giving ourselves that time and that space to prepare, and how we think before we start improving work, to give us that time to reflect and challenge and plan, and also link up with other people and collaborate. And that's where we need that balance between the blue and the red work. And that goes back to the naive interventionism research that Richard talked about. And this really speaks to this other research that was done. First piece of research was done back in the 80s, but it's been repeated several times since, which demonstrated that 70% of all change efforts fail, achieve no results whatsoever. And that's quite a startling figure when you look at that. This was done across multiple industries, including healthcare. And I think when I look back at my own journey and see the change efforts that I've been involved in, but also seen, this kind of number gets backed up with what we see in practice. But I think more startling than the 70% is that what we also find is that only 25% achieve some of the objectives that have been set out. So we have an idea, we have a plan, we've set off, and now we're looking at 95% of our work doesn't achieve its full objective. Only 5% leads to a sustainable change or improvement. And again, it goes back to, anecdotally, when you think about your own work and your own experience, and think about all the efforts that we put in, all the work that we're involved in, how many of those have actually led to a sustainable change and an improvement? And as I often say, this is not about people, it's not about you or as individuals, this is about the processes that you work in. Really good people work in poor processes, and that's what drives these kind of results. And this quote for me, like Goldratt, really kind of sums it up for me. Any improvement is a change, but not every change is improvement. I think we all recognise, we've seen it around us enough times to see that we've seen lots of change, but has it always led to an improvement? And you look at some of the research details around that study by McKinsey's and others since then, and these are some of the themes that come out of that research. And again, goes back to incorrect assumptions, back to that kind of knowing-doing gap. Looking at unrealistic expectations, are we starting with realistic expectations in the first point? Do we lack buy-in? These are the kind of things that are coming out. Poor communication, the improvement, the idea, where we're trying to get to is not being explained well enough. What's my role in this? What's my role as a leader? What's my role as somebody who's been asked to change? What's my role as somebody who's been asked to contribute to this improvement? But an odd one, and doesn't always land well with everybody, what's in it for me? Sometimes we have to understand what's in it for me to be able to be fully engaged. What's those intrinsic motivations rather than a pure extrinsic motivation, where we often find in change efforts we have those external targets or pressures or action plans or RAG ratings that enforce change or push change on people. But what is it? What's in it for me? What will make me change? Poor utilisation of existing skills is heavy on there, which leads to the time commitment necessary. We assume this is going to take 3 months. Actually, it's probably going to take 6 to 9 months. So are we really clear before we start in understanding what we need to do to get from that, where we need to get to where we want to be, Do we understand the realistic time commitment? And that leads on to what's your improvement mechanism? How do you deliver improvement? What is your methodology? What is your style? What is your approach? If it's command and control, top down, delivered through an action plan, it's probably not going to give you the results you need in terms of engaging your teams and understanding what's in it for me and what's my role in that. So when you think about the numbers involved here, as I said, 95% of change efforts don't lead to a sustained change or improvement. Isn't it time we did something different? Isn't it time we looked at, is there a better way of doing this? And there's this quote from that talks about, when you discover you're riding a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. You don't keep on beating it, just until it gets up and moves again. So what I'm offering here, or what I'm asking here, is how we can look at how we've been doing things. Is there a better way? Because as Einstein says, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. We have to do something different. If we want something different, we have to do something different. If we do the same old, we'll get the same results. So as we think about where we are and where we want to be, thinking about this gap between the knowing and the doing, or where we are now in terms of discharge, or in terms of any kind of project that you're working on, whether it's standard operating procedures, whether it's internal professional standards, criteria to discharge, criteria to resign, whatever you're working on, this is where we currently are, and this is our approach historically to change and improvement. And when we look at the evidence that backs this up, it says that what we've done so far isn't working because we're still in the same situation. So this is where we're playing it safe in the where we are environment. But that's natural. As human beings, we want to make sense of our world. We resist making mistakes. We don't want to put ourselves at risk. So inherent within us is something that stops us from misunderstanding our world, or trying to create chaos in our world by changing what we already do. So we may want to change, we may do our improvement, but we won't fundamentally shift, and that shift does often require this leap of faith into where we want to be. So the second part of this gap, which I think probably for me in the last sort of 20 odd years that within the NHS, the biggest barrier is the fear of failure. I see that so often. This goes back to that fundamental thing that we, as human beings, we don't want to fail. We don't want to be seen as incompetent. We don't want to be criticised. So this fear of failure is such a significant barrier to enable us to move from where we are now to where we want to be. This is very much at the heart of, we know what we need to do, but leaping into that successful shift into the doing, the fear of failure is the biggest thing for me, which gets in the way of that happening, whoever it is. And I've seen this at every level of organisations. As Henry Ford talks about here, failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. If we learn to embrace failure as opportunity to learn, as not as opportunity to criticise, but recognising that we've tried something, we've given it a go, and we're going to learn from that. And there's a Japanese saying, you fall down 7 times, you get up 8. You keep on going. You develop that enthusiasm to keep going, knowing where you need to get to, knowing what the end point is, but recognising that there's probably going to be some stumbles along the way, and you're probably going to have to get up a few times and brush yourself down and carry on. So failure is something that, if we want to move forward and move forward in improvement, we have to learn to accept that as part and parcel of what we do. But embrace it, recognise it, learn from it, and use that learning to take us forward. What that gives us is levels of innovation and improvement and ideas and enthusiasm. If all you've got is fear, as Edmund Burke here, the economist and philosopher, talks about, no passion so effectively robs the mind of all its powers and acting and reasoning as fear. It's the single thing that gets in the way of us being innovative and creative and coming up with new ideas, because we're constrained by this idea that we can't get it wrong. We can't get it wrong. We'll be criticised. We'll be ridiculed. We'll be, I don't know, we'll lose face in front of our peers. But this is really sits in at the heart of who we are as human beings. We're conditioned to avoid ridicule. It starts at a really early age. As children, we don't want to make a fool of ourselves in front of our peers. And think about, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but think about those painful teenage years when you just would do anything to avoid any kind of embarrassment or criticism or anything like that. It's hardwired into us. We're conditioned, and when we go into the workplace, it just carries on with us. We just don't want to be shown up or criticised or made fun of by getting things wrong. And that's a hard place to be in if you want to move things forward. That just results in us sticking with the status quo, not doing anything particularly different. And it's some word that Amy Edmondson talks about in her book Teaming, where it's how we approach our improvement work, how we approach our evolution of our current state. Do we organise to learn, or do we organise to execute? And what she's talked about here is that in terms of our planning, are we planning our work willing to learn, willing to be open-minded, willing to have an idea that we got an idea where we need to get to, but we're probably going to be learning as we go? Or do we organise to execute, which is more of a fixed mindset in terms of, I know what the answer is, and this is what we're going to do to deliver it. And it's probably based on a series of steps in an action plan. I'm not always sure that's entirely accurate. So as we approach our planning and our as we engage with improvement work and we start to think about our improvement work, are we open-minded enough to think that we're going to organise this, knowing that we're going to learn as we go? And similarly, when we move into the execution phase of doing, moving from blue work, as David Marquet talks about, into the red work, into the doing, are we then again willing to start learning as we go, moving into, as we execute our improvement work and test of change, we're willing to think that actually we're going to learn as we go? Or are we executing for efficiency? Do we have to think that we have to get it right first time, because it'd be a waste of time if we start something and have to change it? The first one, again, is a growth mindset. It's believing that we can learn as we go. We know a certain amount of information now and knowledge. The second one believes, in terms of a fixed mindset, we know all we need to know, and we just need to get on and do it. But failure is at the heart of so many innovations and new technology. And I'm sure you'll all recognise this. This is one of the earliest Dyson vacuum cleaners. This was the major shift into the bagless cyclone technology that James Dyson talks about. But he recognises that it took 5,127 failures to get to the point where he just had a marketable product. But he recognised that when he started, he didn't just give up after the first go and think, oh, it didn't work, let's just go back to what we did before. He was willing to embrace failure. And what that does, it leads to, let's go again. And what else can we do? Excuse me. What else can we do? How further can we develop that idea? And how can it morph and continue to evolve into many different ideas? It's about mindset, and it's about how we as leaders in the improvement world, and how we develop services and products for our patients and our staff. If the mindset is that there's a starting point and an end point, and it's quite linear based on an action plan, then we're probably going to find ourselves not necessarily living in an environment where it's accurate. The reality is that it's often sometimes different. Going back to something that Amy Edmondson talked about, if we organise to learn and execute to learn, the starting point is the same and the end point is the same, but the bit in the middle could be very different. There's going to be full of pitfalls and learning and challenges, but recognising that if we start with a mindset that being open-minded, with a growth mindset, that we're willing to accept those and deal with those as they come. But in the end, we're the people here today, you're the guys here today who've turned up and given your valuable time to come and listen to this. And one of the points I would want to get across is that the change often starts with us. We're in a position to influence as leaders. Some of our roles are not necessarily always problem solvers, we are problem framers. So change often starts with us. You look back at, if we counted up all the years of experience on this call and all the work that we've been involved in, can we honestly look at ourselves, and I definitely can't say that I've got it right every single time. So it comes back to us as individuals to look at, does change start with us? Because something that Tolstoy says, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves. So if we start and think about, is our approach, what's our approach first? What can I change? What's my influence over this first as a leader? And that influence around how can I bridge or narrow the knowing and doing gap? Then we can start to think about how we as leaders can be involved in that change as well, because we all want change. We all say we want change, but we don't necessarily always want to change. And this goes back to another point that Richard talked about, which I'm absolutely fascinated by, is the fact that we operate in a socio-technical system. So we think about things, a lot of our work is we believe to be technical, but actually most of it is social. And this work here by Johan Eriksson, he's the Chief Executive Learning and Innovation at Jönköping County in Sweden. He says real change arises through working with the informal processes more than through the formal change management structures. So those change management being the technical systems, action plans, project initiation documents, strategy, those are the technical systems of change, but actually real change arises through those informal social systems. We understand and remember more by interpreting. So don't give me the answer, help me understand what the problem is, so I can interpret that and apply my own thinking to that. As I said before, leaders as problem framers, not problem solvers. Some perspectives we can select, others guide us. So some perspectives will be really obvious and I'll take that off the shelf and I'll use that and I'll run with it. But accepting that for others, some of those perspectives will just guide us. So they'll take part of what we think or part of the idea, but allowing people to interpret that as they feel they need to. It's not giving people a prescriptive, this is what we have to do. We're allowing people to understand where we need to get to, but not being totally prescriptive in how we're going to get there. And that goes down to how we can avoid the narrowing of reality. Again, we talk in those human factors terms about the workers imagined versus workers done. Understanding where the reality of the world that we operate in, understand the reality of the current state, where we need to get to, and what is the gap. But I think for me, and I love this when I first heard it from you, and the last point there is control is an illusion. Accept unpredictability, and this means giving up the need to be right. And as leaders and as people involved in change and in improvement, giving up that need to be right can be very hard. But what we're doing now, we are creating an environment where we're establishing a learning zone through psychological safety, motivation, accountability. And when I say motivation and accountability, I don't mean big stick beating people up with motivation and accountability. I mean in terms of people understanding what's expected of them, knowing where we're heading, what we're trying to achieve around here, mirrored with an environment of a psychologically safe where we accept failure, acknowledge failure, learn from failure, and we don't feel like we're going to be criticised. And that really does place us in that top right learning zone environment that, again, once again, Amy Edmondson talks about that, organising to learn or executing to learn. It avoids that either the comfort zone, the coasting, or that what we often find more often than not is a high anxiety zone. This is all about developing a new skill, and I'm not, if what I speak to a lot of particularly senior leaders who have got to where they are in life in their positions, often very senior positions, by a particular way of working. They've probably been appointed based on what they've done and what they've achieved and what ideas and solutions they've implemented over the years. What I'm asking is that, that doesn't always lead to a sustainable change. So is there a better way of doing it? But that's not going to happen overnight. Developing your improvement skills only happens through practice. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, it's but a habit. And anything that requires building a habit takes time. Anybody who has learned to play an instrument, I started when I was a teenager and quickly give up. But one of my sons plays the piano, and that's taken years and years and years of practice. It's not something you just pick up. Oh, no, I'm going to start playing the piano tomorrow and just go off and start playing the piano like a professional pianist. Apparently, it takes about 10,000 hours to be proficient at something. So one thing we have to almost accept, this goes back to the sort of narrowing the gap between the reality and the aspirations, is that it takes time to build an improvement habit, both for ourselves and the people that we're working with. So don't think it's going to happen overnight. But a technique you can use which really helps that habit. I mean, these words habits, I'm intentionally building into this because it is about developing a habit that doesn't take a lot of thought after a while because you just do it automatically. It's something that was developed by Mike Rother based on some work at Toyota. And these are some really simple steps that you can take away and think about. Step one is get the direction and the challenge right. Be really clear about where you're heading. Start with the end in mind. Be really clear about what you're trying to achieve. I don't care how far in the future that might be or how ambitious that might be. Just be clear about the direction and the challenge in front of you. Then come back to number two, grasp the current condition, grasp the current state. Where are we now? Need to understand the reality of the gap between where you want to get to and where you are now. Whether that's subject matter around criteria like discharge or criteria to reside, or develop internal professional standards, wherever you are right now, understand where you want to get to, but be really clear about where you are. So everybody's starting point is the same. Because a lot of these things, if you ask 10 different people where we are in terms of any of those subjects, there probably be 10 slightly different answers. So understand the current state. But then don't start your improvement work thinking that we're gonna work from here to the end. Understand where you need to get to next. So establish your next target condition, the third step in the process there. Understand where you need to get to. What's your next best aspiration? So it could be you want to introduce a particular improvement, maybe on one ward or one unit, or with one division, one group, whatever it might be. What's your next target condition? Don't think about how you can change the world overnight. Come back to developing this habit where you know the direction you're headed in, but we need to understand where we want to get to next. And you really do then start to break it down and make it manageable. Or as David Marquet talks about, you chunk it small, but do it all to make it understandable, make it manageable, but knowing that you're going to get to the end point, because you're really clear about where your direction of travel is. And I'm sure you've all come across the model for improvement before. So I'm not going to go into too much detail around this, but this is chunking it up. This sits in the experimentation space. This helps us understand if we understand our current state and we know where we want to get to. Breaking this down into this model is a really helpful way to do that. Be really clear about what's the aim, what are we trying to accomplish here? That could be the overall goal, but more likely it's your next target condition. How will we know that a change is improvement? Go back to Eli Gold, that quote again, every change, all improvement requires change, but not all change is an improvement. The amount of times it just drives me at the wall. The amount of improvement I see or change efforts I see that don't have any metrics attached to it. Well, how will you know? How will you know that an improvement has happened? How will you know that you're on the right track? So measurement is always really, really important. And then what are your ideas? That freedom to try things out, that release of that fear of failure. What are the ideas that are going to help us drive towards that improvement, where we want to get to, how we're going to get there, and how we're going to try that. Then use those rapid improvement cycles of plan, do, study, act. And we use plan, do, study, act so often. I think it's even got its own terminology. We'll PDSA something. I mean, what is that anyway? But we talk about PDSAs as if they're so common. But what we're not doing is we're not seeing it through properly. What we're really good at, and what I see a lot in the NHS, is there's lots of plans. We are great. We are world beaters at creating plans. Strategy, action plans, project initiation, all those, we are brilliant at sitting in meeting rooms and developing plans for stuff. Sometimes we actually get on and start to do some stuff. We launch from blue work, the thinking time, into the red work, and we'll start to do some stuff. But what we're not great at is the study bit. How do we understand and learn what has happened previously within the planning and the doing? This goes back to not just measurement, but just getting some sense of, is it heading in the right direction? And then how do we act on that? And this second half, the study and the act bit, is essentially the bit that the gap between how we get something going and actually move towards a sustainable change. Is because we're not always necessarily in that space where we're learning. We almost get to doing and think, right, we've done that, let's move on to the next thing. And it's what sits at the heart of that is leadership. What sits at the heart of the plan, do, study, act cycle is leadership. The leadership's role in this, leadership is not about delegating this down to people who who are doing the work at the front line. They're definitely involved, but leadership has a role in bringing it all together through support, evaluation, the improvement process, and also the planning. So we as leaders in the organisations sit at the heart of this, and we have a fundamental role to play in terms of those tests of change and ensuring that they are continuing, but we also learn and monitor and track and reflect and give people the time to input and contribute to those future improvements. So I guess it comes down to, as we come towards the end of this session, we have choices. We can continue doing the same old and expecting different results, or we can just hope that something magical happens and we get the improvements that we want. But we've been talking about a lot of these things, these challenges now for quite some time. It's the same things coming up over and over again. So we have to look and say, is there a better way of doing things, and acknowledge that sometimes it is there are better ways out there, but we're all just a little bit too busy to start to think about how can we do things, and that requires us to stop for a moment. I want to end with a little story. Here comes Edward Bear now down the stairs behind Christopher Robin. Bump, bump, bump on the back of his head. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs. He's sure there must be a better way. If only could stop bumping a moment for us to think about it. Sound familiar? So a few session takeaways from me, just to leave you with a few thoughts. Bridging the knowing gap starts with prep. Understanding how we can prepare our soil before we launch into it. Thinking like a farmer or a gardener. If any gardeners out there, you don't go off to the garden centre and spend a fortune on new plants and then just stick them in some barren soil at the back of the garden. How do we prepare the soil before we start? Change does start with me. Change starts with us. We have to look at how we approach this. Embracing failure as an opportunity to learn. Keep that in your head. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. That opportunity to keep on going with no loss of enthusiasm. And then begin with the end in mind. Focus on the journey. Know where you need to head to, but then breaking down how we're going to get there into manageable chunks. Chunk it small, but do it all. Always like to share a few references from the books that I've robbed all this information from. First one from David Marquet, written 2 great books. Leadership is Language is brilliant. Taken some of the content from today from that book. His other book, Turn the Ship Around, is such a great example of leadership and leadership in action. In terms of psychological safety and teaming by Amy Edmondson. And if anybody who's really interested in organizational psychology and culture and leadership, then the foreword by Edgar Schein, his book Organizational Culture and Leadership is a fantastic book as well, if that's your thing. And then finally, Mike Rother's Toyota Kata, talk about the habits that we develop within our people and our improvement exercises, so it becomes automatic, as we do when we get in a car, turn the key, see about time we drive up. It becomes such a learned behaviour. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening. Any comments, observations, any questions, please put them in the chat. Anything after the session, more than happy to pick those up with you as you go. But for me, I'm going to hand back to Ian just to wrap this session up.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. I'm sure I'm not alone when I say a lot of the stories in there resonate. I think we all can think of a change where we've not done what we aim to do for missing out on some of those steps. So, and also I need to raid your picture collection at some point. You've very impressive array of Lego characters to give messages, which is very impressive. Thank you very much. So we've got a little bit more time left, so keen to get any questions. We've got a number of comments in the chat. Erica, is there anything you wanted specifically to talk about from the chat before we opened it up to wider questions?
Yeah, so I think 2 very interesting points that we might want to kind of collectively reflect on. So Jane kind of started the discussion, and we might want to bring her in if she's comfortable to join us. Just talking about, I guess, the why, and sometimes that why is missing. So it's all well and good having big ideas for change, but actually, if we haven't articulated that purpose clearly, then it's going to be a difficult journey to kind of take others with us. Jane, is it worth expanding on that, I guess, from personal reflections? Hi, and welcome to the session.
Hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Jane Conroy. I'm the Head of Quality and Patient Experience at one of the acute trusts in the North East. So yeah, I think the why, I think for me, is a really fundamental part of improvement work. And I see time and time again in my trust and in trusts I've visited across the country, when people put in place large bodies of work, unfortunately, what seems to happen sometimes is that they focus on the action. So what do we want people to do? And from my perspective and my experiences, we're not going to get behaviour change in that way. We're not going to build shared purpose. We're not going to lead to improvements, because if you don't know why you need to do something, why you need to change, actually, how are we going to ensure people do it? So for me, the why is definitely a fundamental part of improvement work and the narrative that we put forward.
It's a great point, Jane. Great, absolutely superb. But I think it goes back to when you talk about what's the intrinsic motivators, what's in it for me, what's going to get me out of bed every day. And then often the confusion with the why is that often the answer is when we ask the question, "What's your why?" It's often the answer is, well, it's along the lines of, I want to deliver great patient care, I want to be here for my patients. I'm not criticising that, but that's the what. That's the what you do.
Yeah.
It's the why that sits behind it. So totally get your point. We're not great at describing in a way which actually talks to the emotions of people rather than just the transactions that we do when we come into work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Nick. Should we bring Ben in?
Hi, Ben Owens, I'm one of the East's Clinical Associates with this Workstream. Yeah, a couple of things on that. I think, yeah, the why is really important, and for a lot of this process and pathway things we're talking about, it's got to be what's the best patient pathway, what's the best patient experience, is the why we're changing things, but also it comes back into the why not as well, because often people are tired, they're busy, they're overworked, they perceive more work, or we see the threat, we see the more work coming my way, etc. So we change. So when we're asking people to do these things, if they're refusing to do something that's and not engaging, actually, I would say, give me a patient-centered reason why not, because it's a very different question of do you want to, or can you, or whatever else. Give me a patient-centered reason why not. You're going to see this patient, why we wouldn't cover this with our on-call, why we wouldn't do that. What would you expect for your relative if they attended your ED or urgent care center, were on your wards waiting for something, opinion, whatever it might be we're looking at in this process. And if we do it like that, then it changes the dialogue. And I would never, if you ask, I always say, how should we work, rather than how do we want to work. How we want to work is 9 to 5, Monday to Friday sometimes, and actually how should we work, a different thing. So the language behind what we do is really important, and that ties in with the why. So it's a patient-centered reason why not. It's the best patient experience we can give, and that is often changes the conversation. I hope, and in doing that, then actually staff will often find a way to do the right thing. If you go, this is the goal we're trying to reach, this is why we're doing it, and we can't do that because that won't work, but we'll try that instead. If you don't make it clear, just tell them what to do, they'll do that thing until it doesn't work, and they go, oh, stop now, can't do that anymore. If we tell them why we're going to do it, then we go, actually, we can't do that, that's not working, well, we'll find a different way to do that. Hugely important, and it hopefully empowers staff to find the solution on a given shift as a problem.
Eric, are you still with us? You've frozen on the screen. I don't know if you're still with us.
I am.
Anything else in the chat?
Yes, there was one other point that I think we might want to discuss a little bit further, and I guess that talks to our perception and our definition of the word failure. So there's a good discussion across kind of different individuals reflecting on actually it's perceived or reflected on as incompetence rather than perhaps as an evolution and a kind of a progression through a series of PDSAs that get to places. Richard, I think, kind of posted a comment about kind of that perception of incompetence, and I guess some of this also talks to that human factors conversation, Richard, doesn't it, that we started at the last session?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well recognised in the literature that the reason why many clinicians, it's described, manage to keep patients safe in spite of the organisation, and I think that's a really powerful sense. And I suppose the other thing that's worth I suppose, kicking around when we're talking about whys and other things is we're trying to reduce variability. And I think Ben's alluded to some of that. The risk with reducing variability is it's easy if you get into the same car every day, it drives the same way, or a similar model. But even moving from an automatic to a manual is a different experience. So you may be more likely to increase your risk of crashing because you are overloaded by the novelty of driving a different vehicle. So I suppose there's something here about getting improvement into our normal psyche that allows us to make it feel like it's a normal thing to do. So actually, with that comes the normal element of failure or a recognition that we might want to design something slightly different next time. But we're all here again trying to make things better, which again improves the common purpose Jane described. So I suppose it's all these things are contributory factors, aren't they? You can't have one thing without the other, but it's important that we're not scared of it because it don't get any better if we don't give it a go, right?
If I can add to that as well, Richard, as well. I think it's so we often focus our attention on people. It's the people that are wrong, or the people that are at fault, or doing something right, or whatever. But people work in processes, and processes are stronger than individuals. So they have a greater influence than some really good people working in really poor processes. But process also allows us to be really critical and talk about failure in a way which isn't personalised, and we don't then feel like we're not able to either be critical of a process or a failure, but also be disrespectful to people who are just trying to do their best every day. You know, I know we talk about a lot of people don't come to work, don't get a bit more and thinking, right, I'm going to do a crap job today. You know, everybody's coming to work trying to do the best they possibly can. But if we're able to focus on the processes, we can really rip those apart. You know, processes have no emotion. We can really go to town on them. And within process, there is a whole lot of waste and opportunities for improvement within that. People are the you know, talk about the socio-technical systems. People are the socio element of that, and how do we engage with people and understand emotion and what's in it for me, and back to those intrinsic motivations again. But in terms of understanding that failure that we talk about there, let's depersonalize it. Let's talk about process. Ben.
I think, no, and part of that I put it in the chat was around how you embed process, or how you do change. Actually, communication is absolutely key on that. And first thing is communicating it. So, how do you communicate with your staff? Is it by WhatsApp's a brilliant way of communicating with staff, but every handover huddle, for example, tricks that can work quite well. So every huddle on a given ward, you have a list of 3 things they're going to hand over today, and you have to do that for 2 weeks because staff will go on leave, staff will be off sick, but in most staff over a 2-week cycle will do that. So is it every huddle for 2 weeks and every WhatsApp group for 2 weeks? Staff don't read emails. There's no point in sending staff. Your band 3 carer in ED doesn't read their trust emails every day. So there's no point with email staff. It's how do you communicate that to staff, and actually realizing even for those staff you've told once, you have to 16 times to form a habit. So you've got to keep telling people and telling people and telling people, and you've got to factor in junior doctors to internal professional standards. Every induction, every 3 months in most hospitals, the juniors, every specialty change. We have new staff joining all the time. So if we want to make these processes stick, we have to repeat and repeat and repeat. And in doing so, I've long given up being frustrated by repeating these processes in my own trust, but actually you do that. But if you do repeat that, they understand what it is, they understand why, and then actually you get a long way through this stuff. But it's never underestimate the number of times you've got to do that, and using different formats, so email and WhatsApp and talking and posters and handovers. If you do that, then you'll get people. Not everyone accesses WhatsApp, not everyone accesses email, and you've got to keep doing all those things to embed this change, because there's no point in changing something if you haven't told the staff or they don't understand it. They just won't do it, and it won't work.
Anything else in the chat, Erica? Or any other questions from the floor?
Nothing in the chat, Nick, so I think we can open to questions more generally now.
Thanks, everyone. That's really good discussion. Who's going to be brave and put their hand up? Any questions that spring into mind? Or any reflections of the things that Nick said and how they're relating to what you're up against at the moment? Stunned silence.
I'll just pick up on something that Ben just said there, and it's a line from Deming. He talks about constancy of purpose. So that consistency, staying, if you're going to do something, see it through, but be consistent. Goes back to the forming habits again. I know we talked about that a few times today, but the huddles that Ben talked about is a great way. If you introduce improvement huddles or just something which is once a week, you come together, where we are, what we're up to, you understand your metrics, you understand if you're heading in the right direction. Those very sort of micro level improvements, just put on a regular basis, and it just becomes a habit that we come together once a week and we just talk about where we're up to. And it takes a bit of getting going. It needs people to be able to do that. That's the leadership that I talked about at the centre of the PDSA cycles. It requires us to provide that energy to start off with, but it's like a free wheel. Once you've de-rusted the wheel, provide a bit of oil, it's off and it flies, because people have developed a habit. This is what we do, and you'll be surprised when you know you've got there when you don't do it, and people are asking, why haven't we done that thing? Because it's expected at that point. So it's the consistency, the habits, the acknowledgement that this isn't going away. This is what we're doing around here. This is our approach. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we believe in, and it's shared in terms of the communication that Ben talked about. It's been communicated well enough that everybody knows where the direction of travel and what we're trying to achieve. But it feels like it's a hard slog at times, which I always come back to. If you think it's going to take 3 months, it's probably going to take you 6.
Thanks for that, Nick. So, unless there's any questions, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming, and thanks to Nick and everyone who's contributed to the discussions. We are keen to get your feedback, so if we'll put a feedback form in the chat for everyone, please take the time to fill that out, and hopefully this has been a useful session, and we'll see you at the next one, which is on the 14th of July, I believe, 19th of July. So thank you very much for your time. Any final thoughts or any questions from the panel? In that case, thank you for coming and have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thanks.